Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Miss Valerie Smitherman.
Yeah, it's doctor actually.
Doctor,
But
oh my
don't worry, I
goodness.
don't use that in real life.
I'm in the
Just on
presence
the
of,
internet.
all right, so when we say doctor, so that's going to ask me into my question of what do you do professionally?
That is a very good question. I have a Ph.D. in ancient Greek. So
Thank the Lord. Finally. All right, so for anybody that's ever listened to me in this podcast probably knows I am a giant Greek mythology nerd. Um, It's the one topic, Greek and Roman, anything, ancient history, that I've always been super fascinated with. And it's really upsetting that even if you go to college and you take specific courses for it, I feel like it should be provided in elementary school, because who doesn't like to hear about people getting slashed and Hercules and gods on earth? I mean, come on now.
well, I mean, I guess I'm your dream podcast guest because I really do have a PhD in ancient Greek. Um, I'll warn you though that what I actually did in my PhD was I read a lot of Greek tragedy. So there are some myths I know really well from the plays that I spent 10 years reading over and over again, and there are some myths that I don't know really well. So if you're going to quiz me, I'm not going to get all the answers right because
Well,
part of doing a PhD is forgetting the stuff that you're not doing a PhD on.
what exactly did you find the most interesting that you wanted to kind of pursue this route?
Well, a lot of people ask me that actually, and I have to say what originally got me interested in the ancient world was just all the stories, like you said, you know, uh, myths and the idea of people living in ancient times and what their lives were like and how they were the same as ours and different from ours. As I kept on studying, because in middle school I was required to take Latin, and then I decided that I really liked it. So I stayed with it, and then in college I kept on doing Latin, and I had to pick up Greek as well because that's the classics major. You have to study Latin and Greek. If you do a minor, usually you can pick a language, but I didn't want to study anything else, so I had to do the major. And at first I didn't really like Greek because it was really difficult. And there was a lot of grammar to learn, and it wasn't as straightforward as Latin. And I was really at home reading Latin, but Greek was a struggle. Um, and my first year, when we were just doing the grammar books and the exercises, I really didn't like it at all. And I thought, well, I just have to do this. I'll do the minimum to get my degree, and then I'll just go back to Latin. But then, you know what happened? We read the Iliad. And that was it. I was sold. Ever after that, my sophomore year, when I read the Iliad with my professor, Kevin Crotty, he had a way of making the poem just come alive. And I hope you've read the Iliad, because there are so many scenes where you see the gods in completely different aspects, right? So when we think of the gods like a collection of myths, like in Robert Graves' Greek myths, we normally think of how they deal with humans. And you're right, it's people getting slashed. It's just
Sex all over.
awe-inspiring beings
My
just
teacher was
basically
so,
using
yeah.
people
My teacher was
however they
so
want.
pissed at me when I decided I wanted to start reading about Greek mythology. I was introduced to it like probably a lot of kids at like the age of like 8 or 9, just with the movie Hercules was a really big cartoon. They
Yeah.
would play that like on just days the teacher was like, I drank too much. I need to go to put my head down. We're gonna watch a movie, class, and then next thing you know, we're watching a movie. But I remember seeing this, and it was way more like, for children, not so serious. And then I remember around, I think fifth grade, I had a special enrichment class because I was a bit of a troublemaker. So like it was for kids that didn't want to do any of their schoolwork, didn't want to read, didn't want to do. I mean, 12th grade reading level at like a young age, but I just
Mhm.
hated reading. I thought it was the worst waste of time. Harry Potter books, none of that stuff was interesting to me. But what I did find interesting was my teacher, her name was Miss, oh my God, I'm going to blank on her name, but Miss Richme, I think her name was. It was the weirdest thing. We'd always make fun of her about it too. But she'd be like, go out into the library and pick a book you want. So I'm at intermediate school, which is grades 4 to 6. So I'm like, okay. So I go out there and I'm like looking, I'm like, where's Diary of a Wimpy Kid? That's what I want. I want Diary of a Wimpy Kid. And I'm like walking around looking for it. And I stumbled across these really big, flat, like maybe 20-page books. And I was like, this is perfect. I get my stars. I get a piece of candy every time I finish a book, and it counts as a grade. So I'm like, can I read these? She's like, sure. I did not know what was inside of these books. And I started reading them, and they were Mayan traditions, ancient Greece, the story of Hades and Persephone, all these things down the line, but it was drawn like comic books. So they would give you a paragraph of words, and it would be written like a comic book, drawn out with all the illustrations, just like that. And I learned so much about just ancient folklore, and I got obsessed with the gods. I mean, I then I saw Clash of the Titans, and then I saw Wrath of the
A
Titans, and then
classic.
I started seeing them all, Percy Jackson, everything. I was like, this is awesome, God amongst men. I mean, the whole factor is it was so interesting, and it opened up my perspective, because for so long I was only told that there was a God in heaven, there was a Mary, there was an Adam, there was an Eve, and then I found out there's like, wait a minute, that's not in every location. There's something completely different.
Yeah, it is a completely different world. And I mean, you're right too about reading being boring sometimes. Like if reading is just an assignment, it can be completely ridiculously boring. And I say this as somebody who loves to read. I mean, people think because I spent so long in school, right, studying to get too many degrees, that I love school. That's not true at all. I hate school. I hate school. I hate busy work. I hate the idea of somebody telling you, your handwriting's messy. My handwriting is ridiculous. You don't want to see me write anything. I hate writing on the board when I'm taught in classrooms. I am not sort of your typical teacher that you probably remember from middle school or high school at all, because I've been there and I actually remember what it was like to be a kid. And if the things that you're told to read aren't interesting and aren't things that inspire you or that you can relate to, like, why should you read? You know, which is why in the project that I'm working on right now in quarantine, I'm working on translating different pieces of ancient poetry and putting them on Instagram. Because when I tell people about what I do and what I've studied, they're just like, oh, okay, well, you know, that's probably for like 5 people on Earth, and it's not for me because I don't have the knowledge, or I'm not really interested, or it's just so far removed from my experience that I don't care. And, you know, the longer I study ancient poetry and ancient folklore, the more I realized that, hey, you know, these stories were passed down, created by people just like us. There's
Yeah.
no reason why it should be removed from us, except for that's what our current educational system says. It says you have to have, you know, this expertise to read this stuff at all, which is just backwards.
Well,
I
if you
think
look
it's
at
really
like
backwards.
the education industry in general, with all the topics and subjects we have, it's not throwing out Greek mythology or any type of Greek literature or Roman literature, whatever you want
No.
to call it, because who made the arts? Plato. Or Aristotle was the one that created Greek tragedy, all those things we have in drama class, the acting, the comedy, tragedy, action, all those types of things come from ancient playwrights. We're
Well, yeah. Actually, what Aristotle did is he didn't create tragedy, but he described it. So he said that the ideal tragedies, right, the ones that are the best and the most well written and the most well structured, are the ones that follow this formula. And then he laid it out in the Poetics. And his favorite playwright, you can tell, was Sophocles, because Sophocles' plays fit right in that mold. Um, and so that's what we learned from Aristotle. If actually, you know, my research, I researched Aeschylus, who's the oldest surviving playwright. We know of playwrights before him, but we don't have any of their plays. um, we do have Aeschylus plays, and he doesn't really fit the Aristotelian mode, so I'm a little bit sort of ambiguous about Aristotle. I think it's, I mean, his guidelines are good, but you know, you've sometimes you've got to break the rules.
Well,
And
they're
so
old
people
guidelines, and
don't,
we're living in
right.
a new time because I mean we had to adapt to millions of different things from there. I mean we're not slicing people
Well,
open, and we're
no,
also
I know that, but I mean, like Aeschylus, he's older than Sophocles. So when you look at his plays, they don't really fit in to Aristotle's definition of like the tragedy and how the tragedy should work. But I don't think that that means that they're somehow like primitive or incomplete. That's just what a lot of older critics think
it's
about
just it's the
his
same thing
work.
with if you look at the topic of William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare, we still follow his thing. We read a lot about him in school, but we only read a very few amount about Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe had a way better system. Edgar Allan Poe was able to flawlessly craft out his stories in such a way that created such emotion that we do a lot of our plays on that. But a lot of the story textbooks, at least that I read in school, were all about William Shakespeare because of the fact is that's how the system was structured to learn about this thing. This person that basically transcribed each page of one of his writings into another language on the page beside it. And keep doing it that way. It's just that was more information for us, and we still follow his guidelines. Aristotle was just the one that kind of got caught in the limelight. You know what I mean?
Well,
It's
yeah,
that
I
whole
mean,
thing.
Aristotle was like the professor, and actually, what we have surviving from Aristotle is more like lecture notes. We don't have his complete works anymore. We do have some of the complete works of Plato, but we don't have the complete works of Aristotle. We have like notes and bits and pieces, which is why they're harder to read.
And it's I mean he was the wordsmith basically. He's a very good talker. What really got me, I guess, even to remember that teacher's name, it was not Miss Richmond, it was Miss Frischetti. I remember now because I would always say spaghetti. But I remember her picking up a book, and it was this ancient Greek mythology story about when the three brothers Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades overthrew their father, the Titans. Okay, and this got me super interested into a lot of things. Just reading about more about this story about how the gods were even formed. I mean, I could still remember every single god and goddess is. It was just interesting to me. I mean, when I would go to the beach, I live in a beach town, so I would always be
Mhm.
like act like Poseidon and try and control the waves. I mean, something a kid would do because it's mystery. People turn them into the elements, people turn them into this, but people, these stories that are crafted out, they're not taught really enough. I believe that this should be an open form of expression. It should be a separate class that's being taught not only when you go to college. I mean, one of the most interesting things about it for me was the way we thought back then. We were very, very advanced back then. Well, we still use a lot of that stuff today, but we're a lot more non-barbaric, I would say. We're not worried about, taking a sword and slashing somebody's head off or throwing somebody in the iron bull and then lighting a fire under it and letting them cook inside. That was interesting to me when I found that out in seventh grade. I
Yeah.
was like, this is way better than hanging somebody. Why don't we just throw them in a bull and cook them? And I mean, they put holes in the statue's nose so the smoke comes out and makes a whistle noise. I mean, that's creative inventiveness in a sick way, but it's crazy to see how we would go. And then obviously Sparta and all those things. When that movie 300 came out, it's when everyone started freaking out. I'm like, yeah, okay, that's gladiator type stuff. But what about the Greek mythology? What about why Athens was so powerful? I mean, there's a game that came out. I still kind of play to this day. I made it back in like seventh grade, the account. It's called Icarium, but it's based on an old world civilization of gathering resources and building up your town and then expanding, because that was the whole
Mhm.
point back then. The whole mindset was expanding. But whatever island you expand on, there's a temple there, and you would donate your resources to the gods, an offering. And your offering would be blessed good harvest if you were going to donate to the goddess Hestia, the goddess of Hearth, the one that wanted to,
Mhm.
she was, and the
Mhm.
way they described these gods and goddesses was something that gave them their own personality that would help so many people connect to. Fishermen would pray to Poseidon because he was supposed to be this, white hair, white beard. Obviously every god's ripped, and I don't know why every statue has to just, I mean, they're all jacked. There wasn't one god that was out of shape. I'm sorry, at least in this.
There was actually
If you mean Hephaestus, I've heard multiple.
Hephaestus.
I've heard multiple stories from the Percy Jackson side where they say that since he's been working in the irons all day, he's jacked from using his hammer upon the anvil. It goes back and forth. I know Zeus played a fat guy at one point too, so I'm like, I get it. You know what? You don't need to be doing P90X if you're a god. I get it. All right, but I mean the statues. nobody knows that those white statues we all know actually have a translucent paint on them, that they're actually original color. They had color to them.
Oh yeah, no, they did. And in fact, if you go to some museums around the world and you're able to see some of these in person, you can actually see some of the faded colors on some of these ancient statues. So in the Museum of the Acropolis at Athens, the last time I was there, which gosh, was probably about 5 years ago or so, they had a whole exhibit on ancient colors, and they were highlighting the statues that they had in their collection, which went back to the Archaic Art period. So this is before classical Greece, before Pericles, before the Acropolis and the Parthenon, before everything that we associate with classical Greece. They had a previous civilization with this other art form called Archaic Art, and you could still see a lot of the colors on the statues, like the brown for the hair and the red for some of the clothing. And it is really helpful to remember that, because the ancient world, if you Google ancient statues in color, it's this really just psychedelic thing. They're so brightly colored: blues, reds, greens, oranges.
It was the best way to express emotion.
Yeah, they were extremely expressive. They were extremely emotive. Of course, to modern people, we're not used to that kind of iconography, but if you change your perspective a little bit and you just try to expand your mind, it's extremely evocative. It is not cold, distant, far removed. It's meant to be like, hey, this is a reflection of a dimension of your reality that you're living in. And I mean, you've said so many things that are just so key on this topic. For example, you were saying when you were playing that game that as you expanded, you had to sacrifice to the gods so that they would bless your harvest and allow you to continue to expand. That is so important when we're looking at mythology and we're looking at the relationship between humans and these ancient gods. The basis of that religion you can sum up in a little Latin phrase, which is do ut des. And that means I give, do, so that you might give to me, right? So that you might give, des. And the idea there is, I want to be friends with the gods. I want to exchange something. If I give them something that I value, that's important to me, right? The harvest, the first fruits of the harvest, or a statue that I paid for that was probably extremely expensive, then they will look at that offering, respect my sacrifice, and give me something that I want, that I've outlined in my prayers. And we see this in the Iliad too. But some of the most heartbreaking scenes in the Iliad, like in book 6, where we see the women of Troy, led by Helen, they've weaved this very beautiful dress called a peplos for the goddess Athena. And this is the ritual that they did in Athens during the Panathenaea. There are these special group of young girls who would weave a dress for the oldest cult statue of Athena, called the Bretos. And so here we see the Trojans in the Iliad doing the same ritual, except these women are not young. They're the wives of the soldiers. So they're saying, we're going to use all of our skills, all of our talents, and we're going to make the most beautiful dress for you, goddess Athena. Please, please stop this war. Because Athena is, of course, on the side of the Greeks. But do you know what happens? As you continue to read the passage, we see the women go to the temple and they make the sacrifice to Athena. They make the prayers, they light the incense, then they leave. And does Athena receive their offering? No. she turns her back on it. She's so committed to the Greek side that she doesn't care about their sacrifice. So there's a positive view of this religion, but there's also a very unsettling view that I think can reflect a lot of some of the disappointments that we might experience in our own lives, where we feel like, okay, I've done everything that I was supposed to do, right? I followed the rules, I did the assignments, I completed my end of the bargain, fulfilled my end of the bargain, but I didn't get what I was owed in return. Like, how many times do we feel like that in life, right? So in this way of looking at the world, in this religion, this is also mirrored in our relationship with the gods, because we can offer the gods something, but that doesn't guarantee that they'll give us something back. It's an exchange.
Well,
It's
you got to look at them like they're the keepers of the gate. Whatever we try and do, we're offering up like, here's 10 pieces to go through the gate. Is that going to be enough? And then you don't know if they're going to say yes and let the gate open, or they're going to say no and then refuse your offer. The
keep it,
thing
yeah.
is, that's what made them so, I would say, an important piece of art or just history in general, because of the fact is they gave realistic reasonings and thoughts to these giant omnipotent beings, these creatures, these people that we put in human form that could take form into anything. But they had their own inner emotions, they had their own turmoil, they wanted to have sex, they wanted to kill, they wanted to spite each other, they wanted to do all these different things. It made them more human, which I think people really, really connected to. We favored them so much, not only out of fear, but out of love and admiration. But you also had a fear aspect to them, saying that if I disobeyed or if I did this wrong, this would happen to me. My whole village would catch fire. My harvest or whatever would all be dead. I would have weeks and weeks of poor poverty, whatever. And that's why we built these giant statues. People are just like, no, they were very, very artistic and they were very, very expression. That's true, but there was a fear aspect behind all of that. The whole idea was you wanted to pray to these things because you thought it's the same reason we pray today. We build churches and stuff, but we just worship a whole different thing. I think one of the expressions I always say was, if we look at like it's kind of what I use for modern society when we talk about social media and posting on social media. When somebody likes your post, it's like an offering, kind of. It's like, oh, someone's seeing my posts. They're seeing me in there. I'm being noticed. Okay. So you get a pat on the back. But eventually, as society starts to grow and wherever you've kind of come today, people aren't talking to each other anymore, at least in the real way, the real communication, the real
Right.
caring, that empathy. And we've now learned to feed on that misery. And you could hear it best in the movie Clash of the Titans, when Hades comes up to the Mount Olympus, where all the gods are. All the gods are in shining silver armor, and like they all look like they're so powerful and everything. And Hades comes in a black cloak, and he's all looks like he's dying, and he looks like AIDS himself. You know what I mean? And he walks
Mhm.
up and he goes, like when the gods, all the people are starting to die, and all the gods are starting to get weaker and weaker because they were living off these people's prayer, because prayer was the most powerful form for to give them the energy. But Hades was like, you don't know what it's like to not be loved. I've learned to feed off their pain and misery. And that's why he looks like that, is because he found an alternative energy source, but it's the weakest one. It just gives him enough, to keep him this, but it turns him into this dark, cruel form, like evil energy. And you get to see it again in Wrath of the Titans when Zeus is dying. And Hades is one of the only ones left, because he's like, I don't need people to worship me. People fear me because I'm the god of death. And then he comes over and gives half of his power to Zeus and heals him. And he goes, this, it's not like your original power, but it's power. It's what I've learned to feed off of. And that's the same thing. I mean, that's the whole mindset. Once the world started changing, once we started forming our own opinions and wanting to be more by ourselves, statues were destroyed, places were burned, temples were gone, just because humans wanted to be their own thing. They didn't want to feel like they were under an oppressor's foot. And eventually, it's what happened and where we've kind of formed today. We've lost a lot of these old style traditions, but we still hold some of the root ones, the most important ones. We just think that it's gone, but it's really still here.
Well, I think it's true that there are a lot of ideas and practices, and people who are into Jungian psychology would call them archetypes. Some core ideas that are present across cultures, across time, and are even still present in some form in our modern Western society today, although we're not necessarily very aware of them. But they are there, and they do inform a lot of our art and our ideas about time, and the the value we give to youth, for example. And we're living longer and longer, except maybe now in the middle of a global pandemic, but in general, right, people are healthier in the modern age and able to survive more accidents and diseases and issues than they would have been certainly in the ancient world. Um, but we're still obsessed with youth. Why is that? People are
Immortality.
living long, right? People are living longer and longer, so it shouldn't matter how old you are. But we're in America, especially, it's like, once you're 30, you're old. So that makes me 2,000 years old. Um,
I
and
mean, it's
that's,
the same
it
thing
goes
though.
back to this really basic idea, like you said, of life and death, and of the promise of youth, and this idea that our time on earth is very short, very short. Whether or not we can extend life on earth in the modern times, our sense of our existence is still that we're very momentary creatures.
And that's, I mean, we still use that today. We use supplements as a form of trying to prolong our life. We're obsessed
Mm-hmm.
with wanting to live forever. And if I had to ask you the question, would you want to live forever? What would your response be?
Oh, well, I think ultimately no, because I wouldn't want to have to live through the death of everybody I cared about. I don't think I could cope with that.
It's the same way I saw the movie The Last Witch Hunter, and I think Vin Diesel said it best when he goes, he's watched the city be built upon blood and bodies, and he's watched everyone that he's ever loved pass away, and just living an endless, life and cycle of just the same thing over and over again of pain and misery. I'm like, yeah, I think that's the best part about life, is that the fact that it ends. I mean, it's hopefully it's going to be later rather than sooner, but it's so important because everybody wants to be, I want to be 1,000 years old. I'm like, no, because by the time you're maybe at 90, you're beat and broken. You're like, this has been a journey. I've been more than happy to end right here. And I think that's what made a giant fascination with a lot of our ancient leaders back in the day, that people that wanted to challenge gods, that wanted to become this immortal thing, that wanted to do these feats of justice, these things of accomplishment. And when they would do these things and they wanted to live forever after they were king, and they've claimed so many wars and so many battles and people were building statues out of them, they started to realize, like, oh, there is an everlasting life, but I will be remembered for my things that I've did, whether they were good or bad. Statues were built, but then they were ended up taking down and they were lost and forgotten about. But that mindset back then was, if I destroy this whole entire city and I expand my own city, I will be the best king in the world. They'll build statues after me. And then seeing those statues, they didn't know what was going to happen when they were gone.
I am Sargon, king of the universe. All who came before me were nothing.
Exactly. And
I
it's
went to the city of Hatshepsut and I sacked it, and I took from there 10,000 women and 5,000 men and such and such. So anyway, that was back from when I tried to read some Hittite. That's basically all of the Hittite inscriptions. Um, so you're right. But remember too, going back to the Iliad, remember the choice that Achilles gets to make, because his mother, Thetis, is the divine sea nymph. So when Helen is taken to Troy, right, then Agamemnon and Menelaus are like, all right, well, we have to marshal our troops and go to Troy. And so Achilles, king of the Myrmidons, prince of the Myrmidons, is thinking about whether or not he should go to Troy too, right? And so he asks his mother, and his mother says, okay, there are two destinies before you. There are two paths. Either you can stay at home in which case you will find a good wife, have many good children, they will honor you, and you will be a beloved ruler, and you will live a long life, and you will die in your bed. Or you can go to Troy and become a hero that people will remember forever, but you will die very young, and you will never be a king on your father's throne. And what does Achilles pick?
Goes into battle.
Yeah, exactly. Because what he wants is atheton kleos. Do you know that phrase?
Fame.
Undying fame. Atheton means undying. And even Helen, even though she's a woman, she says the same thing to Paris. She says, what we're living in now, people long after us will sing about. So in the ancient religion, there wasn't really this idea of immortality as such, or like an afterlife. There was an idea that your soul would live on as sort of a shade. There wasn't an idea that you'd be judged for your deeds and go to heaven or hell. Everyone would go to the same place. They'd all go to Hades and live as shades. And people whom the gods wanted to punish would be punished in Hades. And most people would just wander, not being able to affect anything in the world or even among the shades around them.
They talked about that in
they exist, but they're powerless.
They talked about that in the story I read with Hades and Persephone, when if she were to eat the fruit, that she would end up being banished to the underworld or whatever, and to live with Hades, and Hades would make her mother sacrificed something, I forgot exactly what for her daughter to be able to come back to the real world for I think a short brief amount of time before she had to go and return back. She made a deal with Zeus, and it's probably over. I guarantee it's probably something like marriage or something. But
what happened in the story was kind of sketchy, actually. So Hades didn't have a wife, and he was the only Olympian, right? The only member of the Olympian family who wanted a spouse and didn't get one. So, for example, we have Athena, who doesn't want to be married at all. So don't mess with that. And we have Diana, who also doesn't want to be married at all, or Artemis in Greek, right? The goddess of the hunt.
That was the whole point of Artemis. She wanted to be single.
Right. And Athena too, because she's a little bit like a man and a little bit like a woman. She's a really interesting sort of.
Well, Athena had children. Her thing was that it wasn't real actual sex. It was more of sex of the mind. She was intellect.
One child, and that was Erechtheus, who, well, anyway, that's an interesting story. But he had the head of a snake.
She was also born out of the head of Zeus from an aneurysm.
Exactly. Because Zeus and Hera were fighting, and so Zeus said, well, I don't need you. I can create my own offspring because I'm king of the gods. But to get back to Hades and Persephone, so Hades wanted a wife, and Zeus didn't grant him one because he lived in Hades, and it was very unpleasant, and he couldn't bribe any of the goddesses to go down there and live with Hades. So Hades got sick of this, and he basically just captured Persephone, the beautiful daughter of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest. And he didn't ask anybody's permission, and he didn't talk to Demeter, or certainly not Persephone, about it. He just rode up from his chariot from the underworld and took her, and that was it. And at first, she's absolutely heartbroken. She doesn't want to be down there. It's horrible. It's creepy. Hades is like, oh, you'll be the queen of this realm, and no one will question your authority, and all the shades will worship you. But she is miserable. There's no bright daylight in Hades, and she misses that, and she misses her mother. And her mother's the same. Her mother's just utterly bereft without her daughter, and so the sun stops shining and the crops stop growing, and basically there's perpetual winter. as Demeter is looking for her daughter, and she can't find her, obviously, because she's not in that realm, she's in the underworld. And so Zeus finally is like, all right, this has got to stop. Too many people on Earth are suffering now because crops aren't growing. So he goes to Hades down in the underworld because, of course, he knows what's going on. And he's like, look, you've got to give Persephone back to her mother. This is just not going to work out. And Hades says, well, I don't want to. But they bargain and bargain. And Zeus finally says, okay, you know, I'll free you from the underworld. But the catch is, if you have eaten anything or taken anything from this realm, it'll bind you to it. So I hope you haven't eaten any of the food in any of the banquets.
Apples.
She ate 3 pomegranate seeds.
Oh, yeah.
So those 3 pomegranate seeds mean that she has to stay in the underworld with Hades as his wife for 3 months out of the year. So that's where we get winter from.
And that's it also goes with when I was reading the book, when they were explaining that, they were talking about a plane of these people that you mentioned living as shades, but there was this like plane that was kind of like, I remember, because the pages, they immediately went from, you know, regular like different colors and things to immediately everything was in a dull tint of blue. And when you would look there, it was just this place where these people, you know, were just living. They had no emotions, had no dreams, had no wants, were just laying all over out in grass and grabbing fruit from trees and just surviving. And that was like the before plane, though, like there is no hell, there is no heaven. It's like that purgatory type existence. And that was just those people that were like in limbo or something. But they were, I remember, because to get to the underworld, you had to go through there. And they were talking about, like, I remember when they were trying to get her back, Persephone back, and bring her back, they would walk through this plane and they would always question and wonder. And I thought that was so interesting about the story, to show this different side of things. I mean, it's a lot of what we're constantly being told: there's only a heaven or a hell. You do good things, you go to a good place. You do bad things, you go to a bad place. But no one ever talked about that middle. No one ever talked about all these other things, or what happens. What is, you know, why does it have to be so definitive that there is this giant afterlife? What else could it be? You know, it was just fascinating to me to understand a little bit more of that from a different, I guess, religion or different type of history. What would you say would be one of your favorite gods if you could choose one? Or goddesses? Or goddesses?
Well, if I can pick a really obscure group of goddesses, I'll have to pick the ones I wrote my thesis on, my PhD. And those are the Erinyes in Greek, or the Furies in Latin. And I wrote my PhD on the last play of the Oresteia. So the Oresteia is the trilogy that tells or retells the myth of the homecoming of Agamemnon, the king, who is, of course, murdered by his wife Clytemnestra in retaliation for the fact that he sacrificed their daughter Iphigenia when he left for Troy. Do you remember that story?
Yeah.
Right. So then Clytemnestra never forgives him, obviously, and murders him when he returns. But then in the second play, called Libation Bearers, their son Orestes, who had been living with a cousin in a different place, comes back to Argos, and he murders his mother in retaliation for the murder of his father. And at the very end of that play, he starts to be hunted by these Erinyes. Now, there are 2 different Greek tragedies, or actually 3, 2 by Euripides and 1 by Aeschylus, that deal with this pursuit of Orestes by the Erinyes. And Euripides' approach is very modern. It's sort of psychological. So the Erinyes exist, but they're in Orestes' mind. So it's like a symptom of his guilt and his inner conflict around what he's done. But for Aeschylus, in Eumenides, the play that I specialized in, these are real figures on the stage. So they come on the stage and they're visible to everyone. So they aren't just, you know, creatures tormenting Orestes in his mind, or dreams or fantasies. They're goddesses who actually exist. Um, and we don't know a lot about them. So we don't, like many of these, what we call chthonic gods or deities that lived in the underworld, we don't have a lot of direct evidence for their worship. But we do have bits and pieces and hints that just as ancient people made sacrifices to the Olympian gods, the gods of light in that realm, so too they made sacrifices to these chthonic deities that lived in the underworld. And in the play, the ghost of Clytemnestra comes back, and she yells at the Erinyes, who at that point are sleeping. They're very tired. They're not used to actually being in the world and pursuing Orestes, chasing after him. And she's yelling at them, saying, "Get up, get up. I sacrificed to you at night when no one was looking. I poured out the wine. I made the cakes. I made these promises to you. And now you have to fulfill them." Right? So Clytemnestra, the ghost of Clytemnestra, is talking about what we think were the rituals that ancient people would have done if they wanted to propitiate some of the gods of the underworld. And the Erinyes are pretty interesting. I know you mentioned the myth of the Titans earlier and how Zeus became king of the gods. Well, there's one story related by Hesiod in the Theogony that when Zeus castrated his father, Uranos, in order to overthrow him, he threw away Uranos's private part, right? And when he threw it away, the blood spatter from that became the Erinyes. And the Erinyes, what do? They avenge people who don't have any representatives on earth to avenge them. So if somebody wronged you in life and then you die, or you're murdered by that person, and that's the injustice, but you don't have any family, you don't have anybody to avenge you after you die, the Erinyes are supposed to do that. So that's why they're pursuing Orestes, because they say ultimately to Apollo and Athena, we have to do this job. This is our job. So Clytemnestra was murdered, and she doesn't have anybody to say her side of the story now. So that's why we're here. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here at all.
You took
And
that question and you went way different than I thought you were. I immediately, when you started going, I was like, wait a minute, I didn't specify on what gods I meant to say, which is amazing. That was a better answer than I could have asked for, because I was going to be like, out of Mount Olympus, which gods would you choose?
Athena.
But you also went, there's primary gods and there's minor gods. There's all those little ones that fill in the cracks of other stories and other legends that everyone only thinks of the major ones.
Mm-hmm.
No one ever talks about the little minor ones. No one ever talks about Poseidon's son, the one that spawned all these mermaid and mermen that everybody knows so much about. Those whole thing, Aquaman, the real, those, I think it's Titanius was his name. And then there's the Titan of the ocean. Oh God, I can't believe I'm blanking on his name right now. Oh no, I need to remember this. This is important to me. Oh, Poseidon is one of my favorite gods. Depending on which story we're talking about, because I'm a sea guy. I live in a beach town. So obviously, when you choose a god, you chose Athena because of probably the power of intellect, the amount of intelligence and knowledge seeking that you kind of enjoy in yourself too. Am I right?
Well, I chose Athena because I like the way that she negotiates the issues in Eumenides, which is the play that I wrote my thesis on. And side note, if you ever give me an excuse to talk about my thesis, I will. So I turn things like your question about the gods into excuses to talk about my thesis. But I think Athena is misunderstood in a lot of the literature on this play. I think it's really simplistic, and I think she's not, or her role is not appreciated as it should be. And I actually I had an argument with one of my opponents in my defense about that, because my opponent brought up the very stereotypical view that, well, Athena is just a symbol of the patriarchy because she acquits Orestes and she said, I'm fully on the side of my father, right? But she also says later on, I have no mother, so I don't know anything about that relationship. She's not saying, I value men and I don't value women. She's saying, I have a father. I know about that relationship. That one's important to me. I don't have a mother. I don't know anything about that relationship. And besides, I value more, protimao, because now I'm thinking of the passage in Greek. I value more the life of a domaton episkopon, someone who looks after, episkopos, looks over, the domaton, the house, right? The household. So somebody who oversees an entire household. The death of that person matters more because of the responsibilities that that person has. So her reasoning has nothing to do with gender, which is the way that people have traditionally wanted to interpret that passage since the 70s, because politics, et cetera, et cetera. But politics has a funny way of short-circuiting your brain, because if you actually read the whole passage, it's not about gender at all. It's about relationships and responsibilities within those relationships. And, you know, that's the core of this way of looking at the world and the ancient Greek and Roman cultic religion. It's all about relationships, like the relationships that you establish with a particular deity by performing sacrifices to them, doing rituals and other things in order to get the favor, the notice of that deity, in order that that deity might bless you with something, give you something that you want. So it's very immediate, it's very relational, and I think that Athena embodies that in a really interesting way, especially in that play.
Especially at
And
that time period too, because if you
yeah,
look at where we take it today, I mean, a sign of a woman in power for so long wasn't considered at all, and then nowadays we're seeing that as given a second light. But her way of standing and thinking, she might have came off as more of a, you know, a know-it-all a bit of a way, but that was the whole point. She was the goddess of wisdom. She had power. She came literally out of somebody's brain. You know, if you look at the whole entire alignment of the gods on Olympus, I always kind of put them into a trailer park family because, for instance, Zeus, he's like the dad. He's the main authoritative figure around the trailer or whatever, but he's a drunk. Okay. So he goes out and sleeps with anybody he wants to. Hera is the, you know, the wife, the mom at home that's all upset and pissed off because her husband's going around sleeping around everywhere. And then you have, let's say, Apollo. That's like the young teenage kid that wants to play guitar and go leave and join a rock band. That's all he wants to do. He's the god of the sun, but he's also a master of the lute. And then you got his
he wants to
sister.
be famous.
Yeah, then you got his sister Artemis, you know, the one goddess of the hunt. So that's like the tomboy girl that goes out and wants to go, you know, light fireworks off or something. She's going out and exploring her own thing, doing her own thing, making trouble around the neighborhood. And then you have Hephaestus. He's like the one cousin or whatever that doesn't want to talk to anybody, like the Griswolds or something, that's out there working on his car constantly all day. Like, oh, where is he at? Oh, he's out there working on the old truck that's never going to start. Then like you get to hear about the relationships between them all, but like the most fascinating story that everybody knows about, I mean, everybody knows the major three, everybody knows Zeus, everybody knows Poseidon, and everybody knows Hades, the ones where they joined up and overthrew their father Kronos. They sliced him up in all these different pieces and they locked him in the walls of Tartarus. Well, one of the most interesting things is when people talk about the Cyclops and all those things, those are all created by Poseidon. Most of the Cyclopses, all those little, you know, the one-eyed creatures that everyone knows about, that's a lot of those are Poseidon's kin.
Mm-hmm.
Those are his species that he
Those are
made.
his children.
A lot of his children, yeah. And you know, I mean, what do you got to think? I mean, that's why if you watch the Percy Jackson series, there's only one person that's a half-blood, that's Poseidon's kid, because Poseidon lives in the sea and he mostly mates with things that are in the sea. Hades doesn't really have any children because no one ever wants to show him love because of how dark and evil he is. And Zeus is the big man on campus. He's the leader of the frat. He's going around tossing beers left and right and going out there and spreading it where he can. And that's the most interesting thing. I mean, if you look at Zeus having all the power, Hercules, then you got Perseus. All the major giant fables were highlighted because of who was the major god, Zeus. If you would have dropped, like going into a club, if you drop that you know somebody, you're getting into the front door. If you're trying to start up in this world, if you immediately drop, I'm Zeus's son, you're immediately getting 10 book deals right there. You know, everyone else prime that of importance because of the fear that Zeus would implement into you. He was a powerful one of the major ones. I mean,
Well, he
not,
was king of the gods. But
yeah.
remember, to take this back to the Iliad again, remember, just because you're Zeus's son doesn't mean that you're spared the fate of a mortal. So Zeus had a son who was fighting in Troy. His name was Sarpedon. And at one point, because Zeus is watching these battles, you know, and he's invested, just like all the other gods and goddesses. And the fates warn him, okay, you know, Sarpedon's life is just about spun out. And we see Zeus looking down at the battlefield, knowing that his son is going to die because he's already mortally wounded. He knows he's going to die. He's Zeus, but he can't change that because the ancient Greek religion, such as we know it, is very clear that there are limits to the universe,
The hands of
right?
fate,
And
the three witches in fate, the one with the
the three
string.
fates.
They can't
There are
interfere.
limits to even Zeus doesn't have the power to transgress these limits, right? So he watches his son, his beloved son, die. And then, as the body of Sarpedon is being carried off the battlefield by his comrades, the sky rains blood as a sign of Zeus's sorrow. So we know that Sarpedon was an exceptional being. We can see the physical world reacting to his death, but just because Zeus is king of the gods doesn't mean that there aren't even limits to his power, which I find very, very interesting, especially in terms of how that's handled in different stories about him. Because usually when we think, oh, well, you know, you have all the power, you're omniscient, like the notion of the Christian God, you know, omnipotent, omniscient, we don't imagine that this God is limited in any way. But that wasn't how the ancients saw the world. The ancients saw the world as being home to these great powers, but they also saw the world as being governed by laws and forces, even ones that they couldn't understand, but they assumed or they thought that these laws must also govern the gods, right? Because there is an overall order to the universe and it's not arbitrary. And I think that's a very interesting thought.
It's definitely a lot of interesting stuff in Greek mythology. I think you've given me a little bit more insight on as well too. You know, I've read a few books. I've obviously read the Percy Jackson series. It's not real history, but it's more of a interesting way of learning and being fascinated with the idea in general. From reading a lot of stories of actual ancient history, folklore from back then, and playing a lot of games where a lot of my knowledge does come from. I like the old style games that incorporate the gods in there, incorporate this old kind of style of thinking. It helps give a little bit of education too, especially times nowadays where people just are so obsessed with technology. It's hard to get them to look up anything about the old world. But the amount of information that we can correlate to what we have today, our learnings, our findings, anything that deals with religion. One interesting I always found with the gods was not only that we incorporate them to different things that are major growth points into our life, but the fact is there's something even more powerful than them, the Titans. The things that, people always hear the story about the brothers that killed their father. Their father didn't die. The Titans can't die. The only thing you can do is lock them away. Only thing you do is overpower them. I mean, the earth, which I found to be one of the scariest Titans ever, Gaia, Mother Earth, this thing that these people would be fighting against, and they would just be fighting her. She wouldn't even care. And then one time she would just snap, and then they would all sink into the earth and be destroyed. And I'm like, what? Like, how can you fight the thing you're living on? It's just nuts to see, like, the amount that people believed and it just thought of back then. And it makes you question if it was really this real. I mean, we had such accurate these statues, these ideas of who these people were, people that seem like they have solved these people, and that's how they did it out of their mind, to make you think that it might not have existed is just one to really, really sit there and ponder about.
Well, I think, again, you brought up a really important point about limits being imposed on the Olympians and all the gods. One of those essential limits is a god cannot kill another god. Just doesn't happen. I once got into an argument with somebody. Back then, I was at the end of my undergrad, so I didn't even have my BA at that point, and there was a visiting professor who had just gotten his Ph.D. from the University of Chicago, so not too bad. But he had this idea. We got talking about it because I was working on Eumenides even back then, and he had this idea that Athena threatens to kill the Erinyes at the end of Eumenides, because she has a line where she says, "Remember, I have the key to where Zeus keeps his thunderbolts. I have the key." And I don't think that that's a threat against the Erinyes' lives. I told him, well, God can't kill another god. And he's like, well, yeah, I mean, basically Athena here is saying, oh, I can get a thunderbolt and, zap you, and that's it. So do what I say. But I didn't see that at all. I interpreted that exchange the way Alan Sommerstein does. And he says, this is just a way that Athena uses to remind the Erinyes that she has the trust of Zeus. She's very close to Zeus, and she has that power and that authority. Among the Olympians, one of the Erinyes' perpetual gripes is that they are ancient and powerful like the Titans, right? And they have this job within the universe to avenge people who don't have advocates on Earth, which is extremely important. But they don't get any respect from the Olympians, and people are afraid of them because they live in the underworld, so they don't get any worship from people. And that's a big thing to them, because they're like, hey, we put up with living in the underworld. We put up with the fact that we're never invited to your banquets, we're never invited to your parties. You don't remember us. We remember you, but you don't remember us. But hey, this is our turf. Orestes is our prey. We have a reason to pursue him. This is the reason. This is our job. This was given to us before Zeus was king of the gods. You've got to let us do our thing here. And what Athena eventually does at the end of that scene is she convinces the Erinyes to accept new homes in Athens, right? She says, look, if what you want is this honor, I agree. You should be honored. You're ancient, you're venerable, you have these powers. We should respect you and everything you stand for. So come to my city, make a home there, and I will establish a cult for you there, which means she'll instruct her people, the Athenians, to sacrifice to the Erinyes And then in return, she tells the Erinyes to sing a song of blessing for Athens. So she's inviting them to participate in the more positive exchange that marks the Olympians' way of existing and relating to people, right? Where people give them good things as sacrifices, so they give people good things if they are happy with them and well disposed towards them. Whereas we don't see those kind of exchanges with the deities that live with Hades or in the chthonic realm, as you said over and over again, right? Hades doesn't get any love, and it's totally true. So once again, this notion of limits being placed on the gods is so important and so deep, because it tells us that there is this balance, even as the world of this mythology is so crazy and there are so many things going on. And you're right, Zeus is out partying and hooking up with girls, and Apollo and Artemis are off doing their own things, and it is kind of like this crazy trailer park family. I really liked your analogy there. There's still this order. So there's still this notion that we should have these relationships, and as much as they can be negative, right? So the Erinyes can punish people who committed some act that breaks up a family relationship. Usually that's usually the kind of thing that they avenge, as far as we can see in the texts that survive. They can also, on the flip side, do positive things and bless people. And so because there are these limits, we can see that sort of flip side. And that's what that's why I've spent 10 years of my life reading this play.
You gotta tell people where we can find your thesis. I literally, when I was listening to this, I was like, she's reverting it back to her thesis. I was like, she better have this thing for people to look up. You gotta tell people where they can find it so they can look up some of this stuff for themselves. Come on now.
Honestly, it is not online because I'm working on getting it published, and so I turned it in. A thesis is like a giant assignment.
You just gave everybody a spoiler alert like 80 times, and you're not going to are you kidding me? There's going to be people out there like, are you serious? We can't go find this for ourselves right now?
I have written an article, like a really short article, compared to my thesis, that sums up all these ideas, and it is online. And
where's it at? Plug it. Tell people where it's at. I'm going to promote it in the description so people can be able to see some of your stuff. I'm also promoting your Instagram too, so people can see some of that.
Thank you. I'm also on Twitter.
Are you
tweeting my Twitter?
Are you tweeting God quotes or God tweets? I would say.
I tweet about the Erinyes. I tweet about sometimes the Iliad and the Odyssey.
So bits and pieces of your
bits
thesis.
and pieces. I haven't done that in a while.
And I'll say, if I took every single one of your tweets, could I turn them into your thesis?
No.
Oh.
There's some funny random stuff in there as well, so no. But okay, so the article that I wrote, if you Google Erinyes and my name, it should come up. It's in an open access journal hosted by the University of St. Andrews. And I'm sorry, that's not very helpful, but I don't have any notes. I'm not really prepared.
That's the best part about a podcast with me, though, is that you don't need to be prepared, because we just talked for almost an hour. I mean, we talked longer for an hour, but almost an hour and 15 minutes. And let me tell you something. Besides mentioning your thesis over and over again, I'm pretty sure I picked up on a lot of it, but I'm definitely going to be waiting for this thesis to come out now. I mean, when do you plan on trying to get this thing published? Are you trying to get it done by the end of this year?
That would be awesome. I have a debate with myself right now, because usually when you publish an academic work that's like pretty close to what you turned in for a PhD, 5 people read it. I mean, it's really technical. it's not really very approachable. It's usually too expensive for most people to buy. And people do it basically to get ahead in their academic careers. And I've been thinking, the ideas in my thesis are ideas that could be interesting to more than 5 people who might not want to read an academic book. So I've been thinking about ways to sort of adapt it to a more general audience and still bring the ideas there, but not write sort of like a typical academic book.
I'm going to get in touch with some podcast people that I've talked to just through doing this that are animation people. I think you should turn it into little short bit videos on Instagram about animations, bits and pieces of your thesis to let people know what's inside of the actual thesis if they'll want to read it. Little fun little cartoons.
I think that is brilliant.
I'm a
I would
genius.
be happy.
You
Well,
say
yeah,
that.
obviously.
I'm the
You're
son of
interested
Athena.
in Greek mythology, so hey.
I'm the son of Athena. What can I
That's
say?
the sign.
I was born out of a math problem, I would say. That's what she was thinking about.
Well, she would approve of that, I think.
But seriously though, like turning I can get some people for sure. I can reach out and see if I think that's a
I
great
have
idea.
less than no artistic talent, so I would be totally reliant on an illustrator to bring the ideas to life. I have really specific ideas though on how the Erinyes should be depicted, because there are a lot of debates about that, what they look like.
Well, you don't want to mess it up
And
like
what
the
they don't
movie
look
The
like.
Immortals. The Immortal movie, they turned those guys into all gold figures and made them look ridiculous. I'm like, it's a little bit, different than what they were actually like, the way that whole race was supposed to be emphasized. They turned them into these things that were like assassins that were made of gold. And I'm like, it's not what it is.
No, there's no one way to do this, obviously, because we're not part of that culture anymore. So anything that we do is going to be our own sort of remix of that culture. But at the same time, we have to make sure that the depictions that we use and the words that we use capture the essence of what we're trying to communicate. So you're absolutely right. If you just turn it into something completely different, you lose the message. So that's where you need to strike the balance right there. Absolutely.
Well, plug your Instagram at least so we can tell people where to
So
find you.
my Instagram is a lot easier to explain than my academic publications. It's just Dr. DOCTOR _ Valerie, VALERIE, no capitals, no extra spaces, just Dr. Valerie on Instagram. I also have a Twitter. It's at Dr. and then capital VHS and then the rest of my name, Smitherman. So that's probably not very audio friendly. But if you go to my Instagram, you'll find out a lot about me. I share travel photos, photos of me in Greece, photos of different things I'm working on, and little bits and pieces of actually not so much Greek poetry, although I should probably start doing that, but Arabic poetry, which I think, and proverbs, which is something I'm working on now as well. But I will email you, or I can send you all these different things in the chat so that you can put them in the description box and people don't have to rely on.
I'll make sure to link it in there for sure. When this episode goes up, it'll be down in the description. It's funny that towards the end of this episode, even though we're talking about Zeus and everything, it just started thunderstorming outside my house right now. Like, I mean, it is hardcore rain and thundering right now. So somebody's doing something they probably shouldn't be doing.
Maybe, or maybe he's just having a party. I mean, I don't know. I don't know, right? He likes parties.
Well, thanks so much for listening to this episode Out of the Blank podcast, and stay tuned for our next episode.